I love to travel, and two of my most memorable travel experiences were to the country of Israel, and what made these journeys to the Holy Land extra special was the privilege and blessing of traveling with fellow Riverwooders in 2017 and then again in 2019. We visited the birthplace of Jesus in Bethlehem, his hometown of Nazareth, a first-century temple in the town of Capernaum where Jesus would have taught. We sailed the Sea of Galilee. We spent time reflecting in the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus struggled and prayed the night before he was put to death. It was a highlight, of course, to visit the Garden Tomb, the spot where many believe Jesus was buried and where he rose from the dead. And then, of course, one couldn't pass up being kissed by a camel. Well, for the past 20 days, if you've joined us on our chapter a day Bible reading journey, we have been on our own tour of Israel, traveling with Jesus through the book of Matthew. Since we began, we have visited the towns of Bethlehem, Nazareth, the Judean wilderness, the Jordan River, the town of Capernaum, the Sea of Galilee, all places marked by Jesus' presence, by his teachings, and by his miracles. All locations where defining moments happened in the lives of his followers, and where we, the reader, are discovering that Jesus is truly the King of Hearts. This past Monday, in our reading journey, we arrived at a place called Caesarea Philippi. This was also a spot we stopped on our Riverwood tour of Israel. Caesarea Philippi is the furthest north that we see Jesus travel with his disciples. It's at the base of Mount Hermon, about 40 kilometers from Capernaum and the Sea of Galilee. At that time, it was the location of one of the largest tributaries flowing into the Jordan River, which made this area very lush and full of life. It was an attractive place for religious worship, but the worship that took place here was not the worship of the Creator, the one true God. Rather, the temples built at Caesarea Philippi up against the rock face were for the worship of Greek and Roman gods. One such god was the Greek god named Pan, who was considered to be the god of shepherds and goats and the wild of nature. He was depicted as half man and half goat. His temple was built into a deep cave which was home to a spring, where at the time was more of a geyser that flowed out into a stream that led to the Jordan. The ancients believed that this cave was a portal to the underworld, where the gods lived during the winter. And to entice them to return each spring, the people who came to Caesarea Philippi engaged in both horrific sacrifices and horrible acts, including sexual interaction between humans and goats. With Pan being the god of the wild of nature, his worshippers also lived wildly, granting themselves all and any physical desires. This portal, or gateway to the underworld of the gods that they worshipped, was called the gates of hell. Let's pick up Matthew's writings and read further about the travel experience of Jesus and his disciples to Caesarea Philippi, found in Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 and 14. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" "Well," they replied, "some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets." And then he asked them, "But who do you say I am?" You know, in an environment where everyone was worshiping something or someone, Jesus takes the opportunity to ask, "Who do people say that I am?" And it appears that the general consensus of those the disciples have spoken to was that Jesus was definitely more than a smart rabbi, that at minimum he is some kind of prophet. But how will the disciples respond to the more personal question of, "Who do you say I am?" Well, Simon Peter is the first to answer, and he said, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." two back-to-back titles, Messiah and the Son of the Living God. Let's look further at each of them. Messiah, which literally means anointed one or anointed king. Peter is declaring that Jesus is the king prophesied about in the Old Testament, the one that first century Jews believed would set Israel free from Roman oppression, ushering in an era of peace and justice. And although they didn't know exactly when this king would come, the scriptures were clear that a Messiah would come to usher in the kingdom of God. And then Peter declares, Jesus, you're it. You are the long-awaited Messiah, and you are the Son of the living God. A more thorough translation of the Greek here is the Son of God, of the living one, as opposed to the dead one. This, in fact, may have been a subtle dig towards the god of Pan that the people were worshiping. But here, right in front of them, stands Jesus, the Son of the living God. This was the defining moment on the disciples' journey with Jesus. They are coming awake to the reality that Jesus is not just a rabbi they are following. He is so much more. Let's consider the same question. Who is Jesus to you? Is he just a character in a historical book? Is he an inspiring teacher, a miracle worker, or a prophet? Or is he the Messiah, the anointed King, the Son of the living God in your life? Jesus commends Peter for his correct answer, and he proceeds to give him new purpose and a new vision for his life. He says, "You are blessed, Simon, son of John, because my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. You did not learn this from any human being. Now I say to you that you are Peter," which means rock. "And upon this rock I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it." In verse 16, Simon is called Simon Peter. And you see initially, Peter was not his name like we know it today. It was a noun meaning rock. In Aramaic, which Jesus would have been speaking, Peter and rock are the exact same word. In Greek, which Matthew was writing in, was a little bit different. The noun for rock is feminine and it's translated Petra. So in Greek, this verse would read, "You are Petros, and on Petra I will build my church." This is a title of a role that Peter is to play in the future church. Essentially, Peter's new role, the new purpose and vision for his life is that he would be the founding father of the church to come. Not a temple or a building, but of the people who would follow Jesus. And this church would be built upon Peter's confession that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And the powerful gates of hell, with all its deception and death, the one that could be seen in the backdrop of the conversation that Jesus was having with his followers, would not be strong enough to conquer the movement that Peter and the others are a part of. Oh, the faith that must have been stirred in their souls that day. Do you need faith stirred in your soul today? Take time to ponder the question asked by Jesus. Who do you say I am? You may have known him for a long time, but who is he in your life today? In the Gospel of John, Jesus makes a number of pictorial statements about who he is. In John 6:35, he says, "I am the bread of life." Jesus wants to be your source of life. He knows that the culture around you says, "Oh, find meaning in other people or in your position at work or in your favorite possessions." But you do that long enough and you'll discover that a person, a position, or a possession cannot satisfy your deepest longings. In John 8:12, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. When all is dark around you and you are experiencing despair, Jesus says, invite me into that darkness. Allow me to shine light on it and replace your fears with peace. In John 14, verse 6, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He is the gateway to eternal life, a life beyond the here and the now. Don't depend on your parents' faith or being a good person or falling for the lie that says all spiritual pathways end up in heaven. The only way to God, the Father, is through me, Jesus said. So come and travel with me, he invites us. He says, I am the source of eternal life. Jesus also says this about himself: I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the vine. Jesus wants to be all of these things in your life. He wants to be king of your heart. So often we buy into the cultural fads of our day, just like the people did in Jesus's day. But when we can say along with Peter, Jesus, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, life changes. Isn't it interesting that the temple of Pan was destroyed? The worship centers of the other gods or rulers of the time are in complete ruin. But the church is still alive, and it is alive and well. We're going to continue our travels with Jesus and the disciples in a few moments. But first, let's take some time to worship Jesus, the Messiah, the anointed King, the Son of the living God. Well, let's continue on in our journey through Matthew 16, starting at verse 21. From then on, Jesus began to tell his disciples plainly that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem, and that he would suffer many terrible things at the hands of the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of religious law. He would be killed, but on the third day he would be raised from the dead. But Peter took him aside, and he began to reprimand him for saying such things. Heaven forbid, Lord, he said, this will never happen to you. And Jesus turned to Peter and he said, Get away from me, Satan. You are a dangerous trap to me. You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's. Then Jesus said to his disciples, If any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? For the Son of Man will come with his angels in the glory of his Father and will judge all people according to their deeds. Well, the journey with Jesus has hit some struggle, especially for Peter. When we were traveling with Riverwooders in 2019, our tour guide decided to go off the beaten path, if you will. And he took us to an area that once was Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, we all thought this was a fabulous idea, but our tour bus and the driver did not. And we got stuck there for a while. Well, in this conversation that the disciples are having with Jesus, we see one in particular, Peter, getting stuck with the thought of what Jesus is saying. Earlier, Peter had made a powerful declaration that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And faith was stirred up in his heart and in the hearts of the disciples. Courage was ignited at a location filled with deception and death. And now Jesus is saying that he's going to suffer and die? That's not what's supposed to happen next. No, Jesus, we should really rally an army. We should fast and pray and take down the opposition and get you on the throne. You're the king. But instead, Jesus is talking about doing the exact opposite. Surely this couldn't be. Let's look at verse 23 again. Peter took him aside, and he began to reprimand him for saying such things. "Heaven forbid, Lord," he said, "this will never happen to you." A crucified Messiah? That, to Peter, was incomprehensible. Now, I'm sure that Peter was very concerned for Jesus, but he probably was also concerned for himself. He had a vested interest in Jesus not suffering. Let's face it, if you follow Jesus into Jerusalem and he's crowned king, you are sitting pretty. But if you follow Jesus and he is put to death, well, you stand a chance of dying as well. And Jesus goes from calling Peter the rock to calling him Satan. Ouch. Isn't that rather harsh? But essentially, Jesus is saying, Simon, you are attempting to stand in the way of God's call in my life. Just like Satan tried to distract me by offering me all the kingdoms of the world if I would just bow down to him instead of fulfilling my mission, which, yes, includes traveling down the road of suffering. Well, you too are attempting to distract me from what I'm supposed to do. You are tempting me to go the easier way. In the New Living Translation, which we read, Jesus says to Peter that he is a dangerous trap. The NIV translation says, Peter, you are a stumbling block. The one who a short while ago was called a rock is now called a stumbling block. Oh, how quickly we can fall into that same dangerous trap. Rocks becoming stumbling blocks, allowing our perspective to become distorted because we long for the easy way. And like Peter, we too can be criticized for looking at life from merely a human point of view instead of from God's point of view. And what happens when we do that? Well, self becomes the authority in our life, not God, and not the Bible. We often buy into slogans and catchphrases of our day. Oh, the heart wants what it wants. Follow your heart. You do you. Speak your truth. And of course, be true to yourself. Did you know that the phrase, be true to yourself, is a quote from the Shakespeare play Hamlet? Polonius, the fool in the play, says, "This above all, to thine own self be true." It is a fool who encourages us to live by that slogan, be true to yourself. And we assume that the way to a happy, flourishing life is to follow our heart, which we often misunderstand to be any desire that we have. After all, isn't life about our wants, our needs, and making ourselves as comfortable as possible? But Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of the living God, says something completely opposite. If any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? Now, when the disciples heard that to be a follower of Jesus and to find life, one must deny themselves or give up their own way, they may have thought, I can check that requirement off for following Jesus because, hey, I gave up my job to follow him. I left the comfort of my home to travel with him, to be a part of his mission. I'm good. But when it came to Jesus' next statement, my followers must take up their cross and follow me, that would have triggered complete fear. They knew what the cross was all about. The Romans who controlled Israel at the time used death on a cross as the form of execution, and they would leave those crosses up for days afterward to scare people into obeying their laws. So when Jesus said, "You need to take up your cross," that would have been very, very sobering. Really, Jesus? We're going to have to suffer? We're going to have to die? Following you sounds way too extreme. I think this is where I say goodbye. And most likely some walked away that day. However, we know that some stayed. And they did follow Jesus right to the end. And they were difference makers in the world. Instead of holding on to their possible 80 years of life on this earth, they focused on the 80 million years to come. How do we hear Jesus' statement, death to self? Sometimes it doesn't feel right, does it? Who wants to give up desires or a way of life? Who wants to say no to what is comfortable and yes to what is risky? But here's the thing. Salvation is free and it costs us nothing. Jesus took care of that when he took up his cross and sacrificed his life for your sin and mine. But following Christ in this life, it will cost us something. It may not cost us our physical lives like it did for many of the disciples, but we will need to deny ourselves. We will need to pick up our cross and allow a desire or a dream that isn't right to die. Following this conversation, there were many conversations and teachings from Jesus that require us to deny ourselves. We read them this last week, like in chapter 18 and 20. We read that we must live with humility, that life isn't about status, but about service. We read in chapter 18 about how to lovingly correct another believer. And instead of doing the easier thing and gossiping about them, we should take the harder road and we should go directly to them. We also read in that chapter about forgiveness, that we should have a limitless readiness to forgive. That's a tough one, isn't it? We read in chapter 19 about Jesus' vision for marriage, which is so different from that of our culture. Our culture says happiness is the most important, and commitment is often forgotten. In those types of moments, we come to a fork in the road, don't we? A decision needs to be made. Will we deny ourselves, our way of thinking, or will we consider the well-being of our souls and follow Jesus? In such a moment, we discover who Jesus really is to us. I heard a story this week of a young adult named Josh, who a few years ago had just graduated from college. His secondary education included a co-op experience, providing him with work at a company that would complement his in-class training. His work experience happened to be at a big telecommunications company in his city. He learned a lot at that company, and he thought, if ever I could get on the team there, it would be a dream come true. Well, upon graduation, the CEO of the company met with Josh, and he offered him a job. The starting wage was spectacular, and he would have great benefits. Plus, the CEO said that he didn't even have to interview for it. Because of his work ethic and the talent they saw in him, he would be a shoo-in. Wow, Josh thought, my dream job, right out of college. Life couldn't be any better. But as he learned a bit more about what this particular job would entail, something didn't sit right with him. You see, the job would require him to sit in a studio monitoring multiple screens of content that were produced by different networks. But the problem was one section of content that he in particular would need to monitor on a daily basis was of pornographic nature. As Josh went home that night and he pondered the offer, he knew that as a follower of Jesus, he was at a fork in the road. What should he do? He knew God wouldn't want him to be exposed to that kind of content. But to work at this company would be absolutely amazing, an incredible start to his future. Well, he went the next day and he told the CEO that he didn't want to sit in a room exposed to adult content all day long. And the boss was shocked. "Really?" he said. "It hasn't been a problem for anyone else." But Josh turned down the job. 5 months later, he still didn't have a job. But this is what Josh said: "I did not lack for anything since I made that decision. God provided for my needs and always on time." And this is the verse that I hung on to. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Now that's an awesome verse when you have the job, or when you're in a relationship, or when you can actively see your dreams becoming reality. But when the only way to follow Jesus authentically is to turn down that dream job, that requires a whole new level of trust. But Josh and the disciples who stuck with Jesus also knew this beyond a shadow of a doubt, that whoever tries to hang on to their life will lose it, but whoever gives up their life, their wants, their way for Jesus' sake will save it, as it says in Matthew 16:25. It's not "you could find life" or "you should find life." It says "you will find life." Friends, your soul matters. In fact, Jesus says, what is worth more than your soul? He created you. You are made in the image of God, and He wants to do life with you. So much so that He came to earth as a human to die a horrible death, to rescue us from the control of sin and death on our lives, and give us new life. Jesus is asking each one of us, what will you choose? You know, this is a defining moment type decision in your life, but it's also a daily decision. Am I going to follow myself in this particular situation? Or am I going to follow Jesus? On June 18th and 19th at the factory, and June 26th at the warehouse will be a time of baptism to publicly declare that you are a follower of Jesus in this beautiful symbolic celebration. This command that Jesus asks of us. He says, believe and be baptized. If you haven't been baptized, this is your time. This is your moment, your fork in the road to say, will I follow Jesus in every single way, or will I do things my own way? Well, there's a class being held this next Thursday, June 16th, where you can either come to learn more about baptism, or you can come to get ready to be baptized in the next 2 weekends. And you can register on the app for that. You know, life with Jesus is way better than life without. We're used to the idea of Jesus dying for us, but somehow we always struggle with dying for Him. We need to consider, what is the trade? All of our earthly wants and desires fulfilled, or the well-being of our soul, both in this life and the life to come? As Jesus said, is anything worth more than your soul?